Good evening. Welcome to the New Black Leadership Coalition on IntellectualRadio.com. I want to welcome those of you who will be viewing us tonight. I am Brother Minister Michael Muhammad, one of the co-founders of the New Black Leadership Coalition, a grassroots coalition or organization or coalition of grassroots organizations that are committed to the self-empowerment, self-sufficiency of Black people in America, particularly right now here in Chicago. And so I'm sitting in solo this evening. Normally our host, Brother Greg Sane, one of the founding members of the New Black Leadership Coalition, is our host every week. As our regular viewers, you already know, Brother Greg is our normal host. He's out a little under the weather tonight. And so I have the great fortune and responsibility of filling in for our host tonight. So we've been bringing to you the individual members, leaders of organizations and activists and organizers that comprise the membership, the founding membership of the New Black Leadership Coalition each week. And so those of you who have not, you're tuning in for the first time, then you can go catch up with who our members are and some of the work that they're doing, the work they do and the ideals they represent, what they advocate and fight for with regards to advocacy for Black people in Chicago and abroad. You can check us out on Facebook at the New Black Leadership Coalition. You can also go to the Intellectual Radio page on Facebook. And you can also catch us on YouTube at Intellectual Radio. Those of you who'd like to call in tonight, our call-in number, you should be able to see it on your screen on the banner just behind me, 708-223-8953. We want to invite you to call in with your comments or your questions as we progress through tonight's topic. But before I go to that topic, I just want to take the time to kind of acknowledge some of the New Black Leadership. As I said, that we've been bringing to you week after week. I want to start by mentioning a publication I hope that everybody will look for in the community. It's titled The Wake Up News. I'm going to hold it up so we can all see it. This is an independent publication produced by the Temple of Mercy Association under the leadership of Minister Rahim Chesed Atten, better known as the Sax Preacher. This is an independent publication that has some very critical information of what's going on in the community at a grassroots level. You get to read about work that people are doing in the community that you're not going to see in mainstream media. So if you see the brothers out on the street with that paper, we'd like to encourage you to support that newspaper. Wherever you see the brothers, purchase a copy to support independent Black media. Also, we want to give acknowledgement, or as we say, a shout out to all of the brothers and sisters of the New Black Leadership Coalition, individual work that they're doing as we've been bringing them to you. And we hope that in the future, we're going to be building out our web so that you can write through our coalition page to the work that's going on with the various groups in the New Black Leadership Coalition, as we have members who are organizing, advocating, and providing leadership in almost every area of Black life, from economics to education to youth development, leadership development, historical preservation. We have authors, we have scholars, we have just nitty gritty activists. Last week, we were blessed to have Chairman Fred Hampton Jr., who is the son of Fred Hampton, chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, who is one of our great martyred heroes here in Chicago and in Black America. So we want to encourage you to keep up with what we're doing. Tonight, we are going to talk about this ideal of new Black leadership in general, and then we're going to dovetail into a specific area of new Black leadership and what it represents in the world of institutional education. Institutional education. So before I go there, I just want to reprise and remind everybody what we mean when we say new Black leadership. When we talk about new Black leadership, it's really level. It's kind of an oxymoron because as the book of Ecclesiastics and Proverbs indicates to us that there's nothing new under the sun. And so we say new Black leadership, not that we're originating anything. We say new Black leadership because we're coming from a thought perspective. We're coming from the perspective of a way of thinking, a mindset that has never been accepted by our oppressors, accepted by the majority population in most of America, and neither accepted by the majority of Black people. However, this way of thinking has produced certain leaders that have emerged from the bowels of Black people that have set up great examples of how we can achieve self-sufficiency, self-empowerment, self-respect, and respect from all peoples and nations of the world by practicing certain principles and modeling those principles by building certain institutions that are rooted in the idea of self-sufficiency and self-empowerment. And so while we know or have heard of some of these Black leaders or these men who represent a mindset that was antithetical to the status quo, antithetical to the popular thinking of Black people, even such as the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, such as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, such as even the Honorable Noble Drew Ali, to a large extent, skillful leadership of Adolf at a it comes to harnessing the power of the Black worker collective and fighting and moving in a direction that represents our own self-interest, and others. These Black men, society never desired to use their intellectual model, their way of thinking, their way of being, the things that they espouse for us to do as a people. Society never wanted us to know them, to embrace them. In fact, they worked hard, starting with, I'll just start with Marcus Garvey. They hard to destroy Marcus America, afraid because he was able to electrify the Black masses around the ideal of independence from depending on whites and white institutions. He began to craft an agenda to show us that we could be self-sufficient. without hurting anybody, without harming anybody, without causing loss to anybody, we could empower ourselves. And so when you look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, when you look even here at Robbins, Illinois, and other towns throughout America where Black people came together in a few dozen here or several dozens there, and they began to forces and build their own enclaves or set up their own towns that were specifically and exclusively set up for Black self-sufficiency. We have in our history of a path that we can take that will establish us as a respected people, in much the way that the Asians are respected here and throughout America, in Chinatown and Koreatown, and much the way Hispanics are respected here and other places, and many other ethnic. Well, when we talk about new Black leadership, brain of what is popular thinking. And so this last presidential election illustrated for us the deficiency, the fault line of our thinking, because many of us to this very second are trembling in fear at the ideal that a Democrat is not in power over the body politic of America. Even here in the state of Illinois, many of us are trembling in fear at the thought of Ronner being the governor, a Republican, a wealthy Republican. We have been so inculcated with the ideal that we have no hope for freedom, no hope for progress, no hope for a future unless our future is tied to what we call the Democrat Party, that we totally lose ourselves and lose perspective when the tides of history shift away from these white liberals who are generally the leaders and enclaved in the Democrat Party. And so new Black leadership is needed to challenge that ideal, to break up that ideal that we need to be dependent on any party other than a party that is carved out exclusively, primarily, and totally for the self-interest of the freedom, justice, equality, liberation, upliftment, empowerment, and self-sufficiency of Black people first. So every ethnic group in America has this ideal. It is only when you get into discussion with Black people in America that we become uncomfortable, we become offended, we become afraid, we begin to withdraw, we begin to look for other options that make us feel more comfortable without understanding how we have been so damaged mentally and spiritually that we are afraid to exist without friendship of somebody who is Caucasian in near proximity. And I know this is a radical kind of monologue, as we have to call it, for many of us, but nevertheless, these are sobering ideals and thoughts that we need to look at. And so when we talk about new Black leadership, we're talking about Black men and women who don't apologize for organizing, advocating, trying to motivate, inspire, and make progress for Black people first and foremost. And they're not willing to compromise when they get in the room of people of other ethnicity, other skin color, or other historical origins that are tied to land masses that have a history of non-Black people, if you will. They don't feel a need to compromise or be quiet or fall in the corner and let other people go first in line. They are willing to step up and advocate for the right of the needs of black people to go on an equal par with any other people, civilized people on this planet. And so that's kind of what we mean in a very broad, general sense. We talk about new black leadership, but you can go to our more defined leadership. So tonight, dear family, with the time that we have, I'm going to try to start a dialogue, if you will, a discussion about a topic that was featured a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, on I believe it was CBS News. Dave Savini, I think, was the investigative reporter who did an expose on an institution in the black community that has produced many formally educated black people acquiring associate, bachelor's, or primarily bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees. Of course, I'm talking about Chicago State University. And so Mr. Savini, for whatever reason, we know the reasons, but I don't know who motivated or inspired him to pursue the story about some of what is going on at Chicago State University. And what is not being talked about on any radio station that attempts to speak to black people, and I do mean any, except maybe Harold Davis's show, The Butt Naked Truth on WGBX, did have a segment on it, a very good segment, where one of the members of the New Black Leader, one of the founding members of the New Black Leadership Coalition, spent quite a bit of time on that particular show the day after this Channel 2 expose, kind of giving an explanation on from the political end of some of what is going on behind the scenes with Chicago State University and the leadership, the so-called leadership thereof, that most of us are. The story it gives us an opportunity to look at the perfect example of why we need what we call new black leadership. So when you look at the story of Chicago State, some of you may or may not know that not only has CBS News talked about Chicago State, Forbes magazine has talked about Chicago State. Chicago Tribune has talked about Chicago State. Mary Mitchell at the Chicago Sun-Times challenged and called out the leadership at Chicago State. And several other publications have challenged the leadership of Chicago State. But what we don't realize is that the leadership at Chicago State and the state of affairs at Chicago State are almost picture perfect for us to talk about the crisis in black leadership in Chicago and in black America in general. And so tonight I want to challenge those of you who are watching, or those of you who may be just listening through IntellectualRadio.com, or you pick this up later on iHeartRadio. I want to challenge you to give some thought about what we're going to say tonight about black leadership. Now, it is true that as black people, we are very critical of one another, sometimes unfairly. This is true. And I never want to be guilty of being unfair. I never want to be guilty of being unjustly critical, sour, or pessimistic about anything simply because it involves black people, because that would be a form of self-loathing. That would represent a deep emotional, psychological paradigm that I hope to never fall into. But having said that, there are some critical issues that we need to deal with. There are some issues that we need to look at squarely because nobody can resolve them except us. There are certain conditions, states of affairs in black institutions or institutions that have black leadership, and there is a difference, that only black people have the moral authority to challenge, to correct, or hold themselves accountable for. And so the big paradigm that we've got to look at is the paradigm that most of us as leaders, those of us who find ourselves by whatever means leaders over black institutions or institutions controlled by black, certainly is not a black, it is an institution that serves predominantly black people and has had predominantly black leadership, but it is in fact not technically a black institution. But having said that, we want to talk about leadership. Our whole ideal behind the New Black Leadership Coalition is fundamentally two things. Number one is that black leadership is so cliquish that we don't operate in any form of synchronicity or unity or coordination. We have pockets that are divided based upon artificial barriers and categories, and therefore we are divided in our agenda. And so we need to build, allows or creates a platform where so-called black leadership can feel comfortable coming in the room and talking to and with one another about issues that are critical to the quality of life, not just of middle class, upper middle class, educated or elite black people, but specifically and most importantly, poor black people. And secondly, in doing that, we must create a morally credible mechanism whereby all of us who aspire to leadership or in fact have leadership can be held accountable for deviating from any principle or practice that undermines the upliftment of the least black person in our community. Those are two fundamental ideals behind this thing we call New Black Leadership Coalition. So having said that, now we're keen to look at issues related to leadership. And so that's what I want to do with the few minutes I have on the air tonight. And again, those of you who are watching, I thank you for tuning in. I know it's a cold night here in Chicago. So I appreciate you spending a few minutes with us on this broadcast. And I hope that you will bear with me, be patient with where we're going with tonight's show. And at whatever point the spirit hits you, we hope that you will call in 708-223-8953. We hope that you will call in on topic and give us your comment, your feedback, your question, etc. But here's a problem we have as black people. And more specifically, here's a problem that we have as those of us who call ourselves leadership, is we practice the worst form of leadership when we have authority or leadership, most of us. I know that's a broad statement, but all of my life I've been a part of black organizations, my whole life. Most of my professional and in doing business for related to some kind of way black business and black people. I never had a desire to go into white corporate America. And so early on, there was something coursing through my veins that pulled me to a certain way of thought that allowed me to submerge myself into various forms of black organization. So this is the perspective that I'm coming from, is that I have a tremendous body of history and experience of being under the voice, the hand, the authority, the decision making, the thought process, the logic, the irrational behaviors, etc., of black people in authority and leadership. And I'm saying that we have too many, from 65, I would say, to 75% or more of us who run something that can be considered an organization, for profit or non-for-profit, religious or non-religious, that is geared toward black people, black participation, or black consumers. We generally practice cronyism. We practice bullying. We practice wholesale self-edification. We practice petty office. We look for our egos to be. We feel threatened by any other black person who has a bright ideal, who has intellectual capacity, who has the ability to think outside of the framework or the box that we've tried to erect, who comes up with solutions that we didn't think of, or who has some ability that the Creator may not have blessed us with. We feel threatened by each other, and so we engage in this wholesale effort to always one up one another, always stifle this one who we cannot control, or lift this one up who will be beholden to us, who will not turn left, right, move backwards or forward without our consent, or doing anything that they would perceive as displeasurable to us. They will not move. Most of us, if you examine the quality of our leadership, whether we're wrapped in black nationalism, whether we're wrapped in Pan-Africanism, whether we're wrapped in the Democrat Party, the Republican Party, the independent voter, the black independent voter, whether we are wrapped in the red, black, and green, whether we're wrapped in the star and crescent, whether we wear the cross or the dove, or whatever philosophical, ideological bent we have, when you deal with us, you find that the reason we're not as effective as we can be in leadership over institutions that purport to serve black interests is because we practice all of these baseline practices of leadership, sometimes unconsciously, many times consciously, because we're mimicking the behavior of our oppressor, who, of course, it's no secret, he doesn't mind stealing, lying, cheating, brutalizing, incarcerating falsely. He doesn't mind. He doesn't mind murdering anybody that stands in his way or challenges his leadership, this is his culture. This is his way. And so many of us, we go to school and we learn organizational leadership, organizational development. We learn organizational psychology. We learn all of the inner workings of the thinking and the logic of the Western world and the Western man. And so that's all we know. And so, it speaks to how America has arrived at a day where a reality star, a cutthroat, conniving, backstabbing, lying, white man named Donald Trump is now the leader of the United States of America, because he is the epitome of what the Western mind represents. He's the epitome of it in the sense that he's open with it. He represents the unbridled mind of white supremacy. But most of us represent the hidden mind of white supremacy. And this is why we identify with Democrats so well, because Democrats hide their racism. They hide their practice of cronyism. They hide all of these negative traits of leadership because they really function from a hidden position of paternalism and even maternalism over the darker peoples of the world. They don't want you to know. They will not call it outright white supremacy. They call it something else. But when you distill it, it's white supremacy by another name. And so many of us, being learned or educated by them, many of us believe so much in what they have taught us. We know so much of their history and almost none of our own people or even the practices and principles of our own people, that we just can't help but imitate them when we get in leadership. And I'm talking to you folks. Some of you folks wear dreadlocks. You wear mudcloth every day to work. You've got African artifacts throughout your house. You may have even been to the motherland and all of this kind of thing. But many of us, even with that, we practice a form of superiority over our people. And so, listen, this thing about Chicago State University. Chicago State University is being destroyed not by Ronner. It is being destroyed by black people. What do you mean when you say that? What do I mean when I say that? I'm saying that black people that are listening to me or who will hear this later, who have an interest in what's going on in Black Chicago, I want you to ask around. I want you to query. I want you to investigate. I want you to think about the fact that there are black people who have been in control of Chicago State for quite a long time, on the board and in the leadership of the staff and faculty. I want you to ask Leon Finney. I want you to ask Hermine Hartman, ask Nikki Zala. I want you to ask Dr. Conrad Worrell. I want you to ask Wayne Watson the tough questions. Because when you look at what has gone on Chicago State, according to best sources, reliable sources from the staff, faculty, and board members, you're looking at a practice of black leadership that is steeped in the narcissistic practice of totalitarianism in a so-called institution of higher learning. What do I mean? I mean black leadership that will practice a scorched earth policy We will castigate, we will terminate, we will ruin the reputation of anybody who does not bow down to me. And whatever my agenda is, even if my agenda is only about me, putting my own friends or family or people that are a part of my inner circle who may or may not be qualified to move the institution forward, but they have a connection to me, and I want to see them make a high salary. I want to see them be in a position to support me and my own agenda. And so when I do things that are not for the good of the whole, I want to make sure I have a team around me of people who will bow down to my dictates, even if my dictates make no sense at all for the good of that institution. Now, tonight, I'm not going to have time to lay out all the facts that are publicly known about Chicago State. But trust me when I tell you, these are public facts. And so it just strikes me as a painful reality that I can turn on major radio stations in Chicago that speak to Black people and hear some of these people get on the radio and be treated as though they're heroes to the Black community, while behind the scenes they are treating major institutions like they're their play lot. They're treating a major university as though, this is my ball, and if you don't let me play by my rules, I'm going to take my ball and go home. Or if you don't give me my ball, you try to tell me it's not my ball, I'm going to poke a hole in this ball, and I don't care if all the air goes out of this ball, but I'm going to let all the air run out before you run me out. I'm going to make sure ain't no air in this ball by the time you run me out. And this is what's going on at Chicago State. And in fact, good people, you don't realize it. It's actually what's going on at the Center for Inner City Studies of Northeastern University. And both of these institutions who were bastions of Black thought and Black formal education for Black people, to prepare Black people to go out in the world and provide credentialed leadership. Both of these institutions are under the influence of the very same people. Yes, I called a few names, and some of these brothers whose names I've called, over the years, being a young man coming up in the movement, being in the shadows of my mentor, being in the room of many meetings where they don't pay you any attention because they just see you as some little guy running around with the big guy. They don't think you're intelligent enough to pay attention and remember, but then you learn to look up to these people. But as time goes on, you hear how these people treat other Black people when they get in authority over Black people. So even though they talk pro-Black, even though they can recite the histories of Africa and Egypt and Punt and histories of Black people around the world, or even though we view them as successful Black business people or successful Black people, what they do behind the scenes is they destroy the lives of Black people. What do I mean? I mean, when you make personal decisions, when you treat the treasuries of a public institution as though it's your personal treasury, to the point that you run it in the ground, you give your team $100,000 and better salaries, to the point you give out crony contracts to people who are politically connected, to the point that you run an institution in the ground and you have to send hundreds of poor working class Black people home in tears, in trembling, in fear, wondering how they will survive when they've been loyal to an institution, some of them for 5, 10, 15, 25, 35 years, and you think nothing of it. Then we, at some point, we've got to step forward without fear of who likes us and call them out. So I'm going to say again, we need to ask Leon Finney. We need to ask Nikki Zolla. We need to even ask Pat Quinn. We need to ask Hermine Hartman. We need to ask Meeks. Because this is not only an issue with Chicago State, this issue goes all the way down to primary and secondary education in the Chicago public schools, where we have elite educated black people in positions of influence and leadership who either look the other way, while poor working class black people's jobs and future is being dismantled, and we participate in that dismantling of the future of black people, but so we go held unaccountable for our participation in the destruction of black life. So like I said, we're not going to tonight to go all the way into this, because the facts are numerous, and you can't see, some of you can see my table depending upon where you're viewing me from, but I have the facts in front of me. And I've been so full about this subject. How do we not have a Hakeem Matabuti at Chicago State University, a man who took a department and infused the department with a higher level of effectability through academia? How do we have a man who's black leaders who didn't have a place to build their organizations, who a black man who advanced black thought, black scholarship, who helped to develop the ideal espoused by Marcus Garvey, by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, of independent black education? He's a pioneer of that in black America. How is it that we run him out of that institution called Chicago State? Who's responsible for that? Did Ronner do that? Did Rod Blagojevich? Or did those black people who I already named have a hand in it? Did they design that? Did they set up an environment to drive out some of our best black leaders who have a history of self-sacrifice for black people? You see, I'm not beholden to anybody. So I don't fear or care how you feel about me saying this if you come in contact with this program, or if somebody listening goes back and says that I'm calling out these individuals. See, I don't owe them anything. And I don't owe them anything because I've been the student my whole life. I've been the cordial, respectful young man to my elders my whole life. I've submitted to the authority, the direction, and the leadership of elder statesmen my whole life. And so I'm standing on good moral credibility when I call you out. You're not going to find any selling out my people or oppressing or being tyrannical with black people when I have had the opportunity to have a measure of authority or leadership. And so Chicago State is in trouble, but the truth is most black organizations are in trouble, because we get on the radio and we talk about Donald Trump and Kanye. We get on the radio and we let these elected officials, black elected officials, come on the radio and television, and we throw them softball questions. We hear about a Christmas party they're having, or a holiday thing they had. They're giving away toys. They're giving away Christmas trees. They're giving away turkeys. And so we give them a pass because we think just because somebody gives away a truckload of turkeys that they didn't pay for, that makes them a good black leader. So you go back in the booth and you vote them in over and over and over again, and they may be good black people as long as you don't put no pressure on them in the room with white folks. You can't qualify them as a good black leader if they mouth in the presence of white people. You can't give them a pass. You can't give them credibility because they come to your lounge or your club or your steppers party or your softball game or football game or some family outing or some social event, and they socialize with you in these social settings. But when they go down to City Hall or Springfield or Congress and they get around powerful white people, they bite their lip, they close their mouth, they do a little buck dance, a shuffle, they ask for crumbs on the table, and they know they people are hurting, but they're afraid to fight for black people. They're not good. So the Bible says this: woe to the shepherds who feed themselves but will not feed the flock. Look, I don't have to go any further than that verse. Look at the salaries and the lifestyle of the leadership at institutions like at some of these institutions where we have black leaders, black principals, black educational leaders, black organizational leaders. Many of them draw great resources. They live a lavish lifestyle. They're well fed. In fact, if you look at most black men in so-called elite leadership, most of them have big guts. They live a rich life. They don't miss a meal or a snack. You see some of who may be at home right now with the lights out, with the gas out, with no food in the refrigerator, who doesn't know how to pay for their car repair, who don't know how to get their child through college, who don't know how much longer their job is going to keep them, or when they're going to get a raise, or how they're going to pay for health care, or how they're going to make a way in the world without being miserable day in and day out. But your leadership lives well, and you smile and take a picture with them. You're proud to say you know alderman this and congressman that and state representative that, and oh, that's Dr. So-and-so, and oh yeah, that's scholar so-and-so, but they're worthless as a leader over black people because they don't care about the poor, and in fact, if they care, they don't have the courage to speak up for the poor. And so Chicago State is just indicative. So Forbes magazine talked about, they headlined their story, The Death of a University, the story of Chicago State. And they begin to raise critical questions about the leadership of Wayne Watson and everybody connected to Wayne Watson, who has been guilty, do you hear me, guilty of everything from bullying, cronyism, plagiarism, fiscal mismanagement, human resource mismanagement, illegal terminations that have resulted in probably $10 million worth of settlements in civil court by employees who were terminated to get them out of the way because they wouldn't bend over for the Watson administration. Well, yes, Mr. Watson is hailed as a darling in the black community, as some kind of intellectual, educational guru, leader guru over educational institutions. But nobody holds his feet to the fire when he gets on black television or black radio or in black media. Well, this is the blessing of having free and independent sources like Intellectual Radio, we mentioned earlier, the Wake Up News, and other black journalists, the South Street Journal, and other independent black news organs and voices who are free to say what needs to be said because other people are afraid that they will lose friendship for calling out these prominent people. Well, they don't butter my bread. And even if they did, I would have to go without bread and butter if it meant compromising and selling out the truth of what I know. And so you cannot have education without respect for truth. And so when you have leaders that don't want the disgruntled, the dissatisfied, I mean justly, now I'm not talking about no matter what you do, they're never satisfied. I'm talking about people who have sweat equity in the game that you're playing, in the business you're involved in the service, in the organization you lead. When you got people who challenge you because they see you're being imbalanced, you're being unfair, you're being short-sighted, you're being self-centered, you're being egotistical, you're not doing the best that you could to cultivate the resources of the organization, and they have the courage to challenge you, and you seek to move them out of the way, then you are no fit to be over people. And we got a lot of black leaders that fit this description. A lot of them. But the mistake we make, again, as the mass of black people, is you're impressed by somebody in a nice suit. You're impressed by somebody with a doctorate degree. You're impressed by somebody who wears gold or diamonds or a Rolex. You're impressed by somebody who eats, who's at all of the VIP events, who's at the black tie galas, who goes to all of the elite functions and whatnot. That impresses you. Because most of us have been dumbed down and we can be pretty superficial as a people. We pick our leaders often the way we pick our mates. And you know how well we do it at that. Most of the time, we're not ready for a serious relationship. We just want to have fun. And the minute somebody puts pressure on us, we out of that relationship. And so we pick our leaders the same way. Our leaders have the same quality, that if you put pressure on them to be accountable to the needs of the constituency they should serve, then they will do everything they can to silence you, to stifle you, to stunt you, or to move you out of the way. Because most of us acquire leadership through cronyism, through nepotism. Most of us do not acquire leadership out of a sense of self-love and self-sacrifice for the people who serve in leadership. Leadership with that idea. And so as we move to our final minutes of this discussion, I hope to come back. I don't know when, but I want to come back and go deeper into the actual facts of what the Watson administration, in collusion with Leon Finney, Nikki Zala, Dr. Conrad Worrell, and others, Pat Quinn, and others, have done at Chicago State to totally decimate a thriving institution. He took over a thriving institution, and he has plummeted enrollment. He sank the coffers. He's alienated the institution from the resources it needs. In fact, he stood in the way of the resources, getting resources that the state was willing to give to Chicago State. He lobbied against them getting the full appropriations. This is a public admission by the state legislator who sponsored and the appropriation last year for this appropriation out of her own mouth on WVON. She acknowledged that it was people at the behest of Wayne Watson who told the Republicans not to give them all the money. Now, what does that say? What kind of tactic is that? When you have an institution whose enrollment has dropped since is roughly around 40% decline in enrollment. What's going on with black leadership? And Wayne Watson is indicative of black leadership. Reverend James Meeks is silent as a church mouse about the decimation of black children's and black mothers and fathers' lives who work in the Chicago public school system. He has been silent while he has watched black families go through turmoil. But some of you may go to his church. Some of you may tie to him. Some of you may have voted for him when he was a senator. So this is what I'm saying to us as a community. We have to hold ourselves accountable. It feels good to blame white people for everything. It's always good to make white people the boogeyman. But let's deal with the black people who have white people on the inside. Let's deal with that. And until we deal with that, we'll never be fully blessed as a people to come into our full potential, because our problem looks like us. Our problem is not Donald Trump. Our problem is really not Hillary Clinton or Rahm Emanuel. Our problems look like us. They're in the room with Donald Trump. They're in the room with Hillary Clinton. They're in the room with Rahm Emanuel, but they look like us. And so as a new Black Leadership Coalition, it is our effort to raise these critical issues and provoke this thought process, because we got to think our way through, plan our way through this thing. We got to organize our way through this thing. We got to deal with the facts. We can have various opinions, as my friend, Brother Eddie Reed says. He says you can have your own opinion, but not your own facts. I like that. So we need to deal with the facts. And I've dug up the facts on what I'm talking about. I just kind of have mismanaged my passion about this and my time allotted to go over these facts. But I do have the actual facts that are public record that have been exposed by others who researched this and uncover the facts through what we call the freedom of information and inside sources in both of these institutions, who give the actual facts of what the leadership, black leaders, are doing at the Center for Inner City Studies and at Chicago State University. So I want to thank you all who bore with me tonight and who tuned in to us. I want to encourage you to come back next week. I think next week's guest is Dr. Lance Williams, a very prolific black scholar, young brother, young scholar, who we're going to have on the show, and you don't want to miss Professor Lance Williams. And God willing, Brother Gregory Samuel will be back as our host. If not, then I will fill in for him again. I want to thank you. God bless. Check on your elders. Make sure everybody is out of the cold. And we want to thank Brother Earl, the greatest producer in the world, here at Intellectual Radio. This is the New Black Leadership Coalition signing off.